You know, there's so many causes in the world, and as we're trying to face today's challenges, and we're looking into Scripture, how do we bridge between what we're seeing today in the world and the things we're trying to do for God today and what we see in the Scriptures?
That's a really great question. This question of how do we actually relate to the Bible? I mean, everybody comes to the Bible, and I think what they're really looking for ultimately is how does this inform and speak into and direct and guide my life or the life of my organization in the world today? So what's the connection really between us today doing what we want to do, doing some cause, we're looking for wisdom, and how does the Bible actually do that? And this is where I think in many ways the modern church has gotten off track, because again, what we do is the small fragmentary thing. And instead, I think the thing that we can do with the Bible is go to it, and once we've discovered the Bible is a redemptive story of God's restoring the world, He's bringing the world back into what He wanted it to be in the first place, suddenly when we're looking for wisdom from the Scriptures for, well, how does Scripture guide specifically the things we want to do as an organization or as, you know, in my own personal life, the things that I'm trying to do? Narrative is one thing, and I've talked already about story. It's an important idea. But I think one step even beyond story or narrative is the idea of drama. And what I love about the drama analogy when I'm thinking about Scripture is that a drama is a story, but it isn't really a drama until it's embodied, until it's acted out, until somebody is actually playing the part on a stage, and that story is actually happening. It's one thing to sit down and read a book about a story, and there's a distancing there. It's like I can read about anybody's story, and it's their story, but when I'm in a drama, suddenly I'm playing that story in the world, on the stage. And so if we think of our lives as being on God's stage, suddenly the Scriptures, they tell us the script of everything that God has done before with other players. But now I'm on stage. We're on stage in the world. Our organizations are players in the drama. And so we have to embody the wisdom of Scripture. And God says, I'm giving you a lot of help. I'm giving you a lot of direction about what's happened before. You can see the mistakes that people made. You can see the good things that I've done through people. Now it's your turn. How are you going to carry this big story forward in your time? And the way to do that is to be immersed in the narrative so that you can now dramatize the story. You can embody God's wisdom in the world by carrying that into today's world, which in many ways is a new stage. It's a different setting. And we have to do that, and it means we have to be engaged in that story in order to make it happen.
Building on what you just said, how would you advise thought leaders to engage their worlds based on the Scriptures that they're reading?
There's a number of ways to do that. So if we continue with this drama idea, I think the thing we can do when we go to Scripture is, yes, we can find specific statements of wisdom. I mean, if you go to a proverb, that might speak exactly to the situation. If there's an ethical teaching in one of Paul's letters in the New Testament, that can speak directly to our situation today. But in terms of this bigger idea, I think one way to think about how do I actually go to Scripture and use it to inform my work in my ministry, my leadership, my organization, what we're doing in the world. The thing to do with Scripture, I think, overall, is to go back and be so immersed in the story that I can see examples, actually, in Scripture of what happened before and how that speaks to my situation today. So if we think of Scripture as this script of the earlier parts of the drama, how God was interacting on that stage in that time, I don't necessarily always find direct analogies. I might, but the bigger idea is I go back and I see this is what happened before. It's like this situation here, and I can be informed by following the example or refraining from a negative example. And here I'll use an example from the life of Jesus. Jesus, in many ways, was reliving the history of Israel in his own life. It's interesting. He starts off by getting baptized in the Jordan River, just like Israel crossed into the Jordan. He goes into the wilderness and he's tempted. And I think, where have I heard this before? Israel was in the wilderness and was tempted. Adam and Eve were tempted. So here's a temptation coming to a new representative of Israel, and there's already a history in the script of failure on these fronts. Adam and Eve failed. Israel failed in the desert to be God's holy people, to follow his direction. And so now Jesus comes, he quotes from the book of Deuteronomy and says, I'm reliving this story today, but this time I'm not going to follow Israel's negative example. I'm going to pass the test by trusting in God and following His Word. And so Jesus is reliving the story, but this time with a new outcome. And that's the way we can oftentimes use Scripture, is be informed by how they lived the story, both positive and negative examples of people throughout the history of the story. But in our time on the stage, we're getting instruction because we can see where the dangers are. We can see what good things can happen when we follow well. And we're living the story in our new context so that God's will is brought to the world. And hopefully we read the Scriptures well. We are informed and taught and directed and guided so we can play our parts better than sometimes it's been played in the past. But it's a real stage. I mean, this is real life. And so the tests are real. And what God has given us in the Scriptures, I think, is a resource that is a gift to us. It tells us everything we need to know. He's given us His Spirit. We're guided by our spiritual coaches, our pastors, our leaders, and all of this helps us to play our parts well. The Scriptures are one really important part of that, and they're foundational for our understanding. Am I just randomly making up things in my life? Are our organizations, are we just day to day and we kind of just address issues as they come up kind of randomly? No, we know that we're part of a story, and our organizations have stories themselves, but the Scriptures tell us, yes, you're fitting into the big story of redemption, or you're not. And that's where Scripture really helps us.
So what's the difference between picking a scripture that represents your cause and finding your cause within the narrative of Scripture? And then explain to us, how do we make that transition?
So now we're asking the question, how am I going to actually relate the Scripture to the cause of my organization? How do I actually make sure that the Scripture, in some real sense, is the foundation for what we're doing? Typically, you'll see people, and I hate to say this, but oftentimes taking a verse, and so often those verses are just taken out of context of what's happening in the bigger passage of which they're a part. And I know the temptation. It's so fun to find a verse that kind of says exactly what you want to say, and it's this little statement, and it feels and sounds good. But I think I would urge us to resist that temptation, because I think actually what organizations might consider doing would be a deeper and maybe in some ways a harder thing, and that is have an organizational conversation about how does the mission of this organization fit into the mission of God in the world, as told in the narrative of Scripture. What actually is the connection? And maybe, rather than just a verse across a letterhead, that what we can find is that there's actually a statement of some sort. It doesn't have to be super long, it doesn't have to be a whole theology, but it can be a short statement about how the mission of this organization is not just superficially scriptural, not just a fragment of Scripture tells us, that's our foundation, but the deep mission of this organization is related to the deep story of Scripture in some significant way.